And then I was thinking, what else could I do? Well, what's the opposite of poetry? An action movie. What's the greatest action movie? Obviously, it's Die Hard. And so for a long time, I thought of the, to me, delightful notion of telling Die Hard largely via poetry. And it was one of those ideas that a sort of procrastination project I would think about when I should be doing other things, when deadlines loomed. And then essentially when a pandemic happened, I had a production that was upcoming that wasn't going to happen anymore. And I'd been working on a play that was, I think, would have been a perfectly good play, essentially about sort of grief and loss. And I thought, I don't want to be writing this now. When we get back to theatres after the pandemic, I'm not sure anyone's going to want to watch this play about grief and loss, having just lived through global grief and loss. I think I want to do the idea which is the most sort of enjoyable and comic and warm and human and soaring and silly idea I can think of. I think it's time to write that Die Hard play.
Welcome to the Stark Reflections on Writing and Publishing podcast. There has never been a better time for writers. More information, options, and opportunities are available to you, but navigating these requires insight. Join Mark Leslie Lefebvre as he draws upon more than a quarter century of experience as a writer, a bookseller, and a trusted book industry consultant to explore and reflect on the writing and publishing landscape to help you make informed choices on your writer journey.
Hello, Reflectives, and welcome to episode 403 of the Stark Reflections podcast. This is your host, Mark Leslie Lefebvre. In today's episode, I have an interview with Richard Marsh, who is a writer of film, TV, theater, to-do lists. He's an actor of stage, radio, and social events, and the CEO of MCU, the Marsh Connected Universe. Now, Richard is also the genius playwright and poet behind Yippee Ki-Yay, the acclaimed one-man parody celebration of Die Hard told in poetic verse. Now, that interview with Richard is coming up later in this episode, but first, let's hear a word about this episode's sponsor.
Hey, writer! Are you spending countless hours searching for answers to your writing questions but getting nowhere? It's time you stopped endlessly searching and tuned into the Show Don't Tell Writing podcast with me, Suzie Vidori, where I'll be your personal writing coach. It's a weekly podcast show where I bring you writing techniques, best practices, motivation, inspirational stories from real live authors out there making it in the world, and you'll also get tons of actionable advice that can help you turn that book you're writing into the bestseller you know deep down that it can be. Just search for Show Don't Tell Writing with Suzie Vidori where you listen to your favorite podcasts like this one, and I will see you over there.
That's right, this podcast is sponsored by Suzie Vidori's Show Don't Tell Writing podcast. Suzie's not only been a guest on this podcast, she is a good friend of mine who is an excellent coach, but on Friday, March 7th, 2025 at 9 a.m. Pacific or noon Eastern, you can join me as Suzie's special guest on a free live podcast event called Navigating Today's Publishing Landscape. So Suzie and I will be sharing a presentation and a live Q&A session for writers, basically looking at information about what's going on in the publishing landscape. And of course, as I am very fond of doing, sharing a special focus on the many opportunities and challenges currently faced by authors. So again, you can check that out. There'll be a link for it at the show notes, and a huge thank you to our sponsor, Suzie Vidori and the Show Don't Tell Writing podcast. But I also want to say a huge shout out and thank you to those who support this podcast over at patreon.com/starkreflections, as well as the people who are my coffee buddies, not butters, my coffee buddies over at buymeacoffee.com/Mark Leslie. Thank you guys so much for your financial support of the podcast. That does help compensate me for some of the time I put into this weekly podcast. But let's roll bumper and get into some of those other pre-interview bits. And in terms of comments from recent episodes, over at starkreflections.ca in the comments section for episode 402, The Visible Author Method of Marketing with Laurie Cooper, Edwin Downward said, "It's the build your own process that hits me the most about this episode. It took me a long time to figure out my own process, which I now encapsulate in 3 steps. 1, listen to all the advice I can. 2, play with the advice that resonates with me where I am now. 3, adopt the advice that works for me. I'm now thinking I need to add a step 4. 4, this is an iterative process, meaning it's okay to drop items, build into step 3 when they no longer work for me." Thank you so much for that, Edwin. I love hearing what you're thinking or reflecting on when you listen to the episodes. And I really appreciate that you have those 3 steps. I have very similar steps myself. I try to take in as much information as I can about various aspects about the book industry, continually learning. And again, it's so important, I'm glad you say that, is you consider the advice, you play with it, and then you figure out a way to adapt or adopt that advice. And I think that's such an important step that authors need to consider, is how to adapt that advice. So thank you, Edwin, for sharing that. And just want to mention to anyone who's thinking about reflecting on what they're thinking about, what they're learning, what they want to comment on about any of the episodes, you can do that over at starkreflections.ca. You can also tag me on the socials or message me directly. And I want to say a huge shout out and thank you to those who left me some comments, particularly on my rambling episode, the Rambling Reflections from the Road episode, where I talked about Superstar's writing seminars and the no politics / no religion rule, and how I thought that what the real intent of that was, and my sort of thoughts about the challenge of the divisiveness that we have, and ways that we can consider togetherness. But that is it for comments. Now I'm going to roll the bumper and play a little bit of a personal update. I am in the throes of working on the next pass of a book I'm co-authoring with Maddie Dalrymple called The Podcast Guest Playbook. We are working on sort of it's the second or third pass of the manuscript back and forth. And when I finish that off, I can return to working on my book called A Book in Hand, which again I had to put on the back burner and delayed with all the personal travel, etc. And also I've been working on. I recorded a keynote for a forthcoming conference, the BookFest conference. It's a 12-minute keynote talking about the value and importance of writers. And I've not only recorded that podcast, but I've also done some additional work on the thoughts. I'm working it into an essay as well. It'll probably be something I end up sharing on an episode here, and maybe something that I share specifically for patrons, as well as that extra content, just to provide that extra content for those awesome folks who support the podcast over at patreon.com, as well as the Buy Me a Coffee. But doing that keynote and focusing on thinking about the positive ways that we as writers can impact the world, it really ties in to something Richard says in the interview that you're about to listen to. And you heard a little bit of it in the teaser at the beginning of this episode, but that's something that's really important is Richard had a play he was working on, but it had a lot of darkness and it had some sadness and things like that in it. And as a writer, he has lots of different ideas and concepts that he's constantly toying with. He talks about, you'll hear, having all these different projects that haven't really, he's written them, but they're just kind of sitting there until the right thing happens or the right timing happens. And it was the timing of not wanting to release this darker piece that had sadness and then moving, that became an opportunity for him to roll out Die Hard, Yippee Ki-Yay, I should say, the stage play, parody of Die Hard, and just how much joy that has brought the world. For people like me, gigantic fans who just love this movie so much, and yet it's another way. Not only did I enjoy the show and obviously getting a chance to chat with Richard, I enjoyed the fact that the show exists. Then I got a chance to see it, and I got a chance to experience it with my kid. And then I also got a chance to experience it with a whole bunch of a room full of diehard nerds. And isn't that powerful? Isn't that amazing that we as writers can take something like a person's love for a film or a piece of art or music or whatever, and we can leverage that love in a new way. We can transcend time and space and share something so beautifully intimate. And that's something that I've been continuing to think a lot about. And in my own writing, in both fiction as well as the nonfiction writing bits that I'm doing, and in the speaking that I'm doing in the writing and publishing community, that's something that I plan on continuing to work in as I continue to think about those things. But that's it for my personal update. I'm going to roll the bumper, and then you, dear listener, are going to get an opportunity to hear this wonderful conversation that I had with Richard Marsh. Hey, Richard, welcome to the Stark Reflections podcast.
Hey, Mark, how are you?
I'm thrilled to have you on the podcast, only because I heard of you when I was working on my book about Die Hard and was writing about you, and then I was like, oh, it'd be so cool if I could get to the UK and see Richard on stage doing this wonderful one-man performance, and lo and behold, you came right into my neck of the woods. I was so thrilled. I want to talk about the origin of Yippee Ki-Yay, the stage play. I want because you had mentioned that it had something to do with, I don't know, some global thing that was happening.
Yeah, there was a sort of disease which went round. So it was ever since I started writing poetry, I've been interested in telling stories which don't seem like they would necessarily be told via poetry, using poetry to tell exactly those stories. So a good friend of mine, Katie Bonna, and I did a play together called Dirty Great Love Story, and that was a poetry rom-com. And since then, I've been thinking, what else can I do?
That was a stage show, right? That wasn't a radio drama, is that?
Yeah, that's a stage show. I have written for the radio as well. I've written for the BBC over here, but that was a stage show. And then I was thinking, what else could I do? Well, what's the opposite of poetry? An action movie. What's the greatest action movie? Obviously, it's Die Hard. And so for a long time, I thought of the sort of this to me delightful notion of telling Die Hard largely via poetry. And it was one of those ideas that a sort of procrastination project I would think about when I should be doing other things, when deadlines loomed. And then essentially when a pandemic happened, I had a production that was upcoming that wasn't going to happen anymore. And I'd been working on a play that was, I think, would have been a perfectly good play, essentially about sort of grief and loss. And I thought, I don't want to be writing this now. When we get back to theatres after the pandemic, I'm not sure anyone's going to want to watch this play about grief and loss, having just lived through global grief and loss. I think I want to do the idea which is the most sort of enjoyable and comic and warm and human and soaring and silly idea I can think of. I think it's time to write that Die Hard play. And that's what felt like the right time, and I was sort of homeschooling my children, and what could be more escapist and more fun than pretending to be John McClane, and it had sort of two. My ideas often come from things which make me laugh. So one idea which made me laugh was the idea of Die Hard in a poem, and then the other idea that made me laugh is those of you who are listening to this podcast. I'm a skinny, bespectacled British man. I'm sort of very much not the casting of John McClane, and that made me laugh too. The idea of this sort of unlikely physical hero, and so those two things which made me laugh were a good place to start. And then from then on, the job was sort of to both rework and retell the Die Hard story, and also add a sort of a personal story alongside of what it is to be a Die Hard fan, and how love and life change as you go through life from sort of first love to being parents.
Well, I have to say, I mean, absolutely brilliant show, because not only did you pull off telling the whole Die Hard story from every point of view, playing the different characters, in such a wonderfully brilliant way. But that personal story really added a beautiful element to the, like, you took an existing fantastic script, you adapted it into poetry with a lot of humor and a lot like physical humor and interactions with the audience and stuff like that, which I just thought were absolutely wonderful. And then this completely unexpected subplot of the personal, like again, the personal story of two nerds who love Die Hard and fall in love with the movie. I just love how you constantly have that backflash. Now you're John McClane in the tower, covered in blood, fake blood, obviously, and then you cut to. I love that. I mean, is so that element must have been important as well, not just telling the Die Hard story, right?
That's right. So when I sort of seriously came to sit down and work out how I was going to do this idea, very early on I felt, well, I don't want to solely retell Die Hard. There are a lot of shows which parody movies, and they are essentially they're having laughs with the source material. Some of them tell the whole story of the source material, many of them don't. And that's great. And I've watched some of those and really enjoyed them. But I wanted to do two things. I wanted to both tell all of Die Hard, and I wanted to also tell a personal story alongside that. So I wasn't solely telling Die Hard, but actually, you know, if any of your listeners ever watched the show, the telling of Die Hard has meaning beyond the telling of Die Hard. It has meaning in the personal story. Yeah. And the personal story, it echoes the position of John and Holly in the movie. So in the movie, John and Holly are, I'm sure all of your listeners will know this, particularly listening to this episode, but John and Holly are estranged. They haven't seen each other for almost 6 months. He goes to try to reconcile with her on Christmas Eve. Like many couples at Christmas, they argue. Unlike many couples at Christmas, they're unable to reconcile due to terrorist action. And I think that's sort of, for me, one of the reasons Die Hard has lasted and is as beloved now as it was when it was released is that it has real truth to it. You know, that we all love our families. We all love seeing them at Christmas time, but also our families can be a lot. It can be stressful. And I think there's real truth to the John and Holly's relationship in Die Hard. And I wanted to write a personal story of what it is to be a fan of a movie, what it is to love a piece of art, and how your love of a piece of art. You know, if you hear a song playing in your junior high school prom and that's your first kiss, then that song hits you so strongly. And then when you hear it again in your 20s, it hits you with not only what you felt the first time, but how you've changed when you hear it in your 20s. And if you hear it again in your 30s or your 40s, art impacts us differently as we go through life. And I wanted to talk about that because Die Hard had impacted me so much when I saw it on a VHS when I was a child, that I was now sitting here rewriting it in poetry, and I wanted to talk about what it is to be a fan of Die Hard as well as to retell Die Hard. And so the show tells two stories. It tells the story of Die Hard, which takes place over one night, and it tells the story of being a fan of Die Hard, which takes place over a lifetime. And to me, once I'd worked out structurally how to do that, I was a bit nervous as to whether it would be overly complicated, but it turns out I was underestimating audiences, and it's perfectly easy to understand. And I think it is what makes the show what it is, really. So I'm really glad you responded to it.
Well, it's in the way that I watch Die Hard at least once a year, and have since the early 80s when it first came out. This is the kind of stage show I would want to go to again, also because you did have some dynamic interactions with the audience. It wasn't a huge part of the show, but there were the layered bits. I mean, you're in Canada. There's a mention of Trudeau. There's a mention of some Canadian culture and locales and stuff like that, which obviously you didn't do when you were performing. So let's talk about the stage show. You first performed in London or in the UK?
Yeah, so started off in the UK. So the first time I actually performed it at all was my director, Hal Chambers. When I was trying to get him on board at the beginning of the rehearsal process, he was assistant director on an Royal Shakespeare Company production at a Barbican Theatre in London, and Hal wanted to hear the script, and I went to meet him in the bar of the Barbican Theatre in London, and Hal made me read him the whole script in the bar of the Barbican, and I at that point I really wanted him to do it, but it was in a bar and people walking past, and I thought, I've actually got to do my best performance here to convince him to do the show. And so the first time I did it was sort of just like a madman, sort of spewing this poetry in the bar with people walking past going, what terrorists? What are you talking about? Who's Carl? who's Gruber? You know, well, I guess it was Christmas, so maybe it had worked out who it was, but Christmas time. But it was the first time I did, and the first time we did it in a sort of proper public performance was at a theatre called the Omnibus in London in March of 2022. Then we sort of did some more previews. James Seabright came on to produce it, and it actually produced. The premiere was at the Edinburgh Fringe in 2022, summer 2022. And since then, we've been touring around the UK. James decided to try the US, and so we toured the US in Christmas 2023. And then we've been to Australia, to the Adelaide Fringe, touring around the UK more, and then back to the US and Canada in 2024 to 2020 to this year, to 2025. And yeah, I've never been to Canada before, so overjoyed to be in Toronto. People have told me perhaps I've chosen one of the colder parts of the year.
Yeah, it was one of the worst times of the year to come to Canada. I mean, it was so funny. I saw, I was like, oh my God, he's coming to Canada. I was like, I gotta take my son. This has been a thing we've done our entire lives together. Well, I mean, once he got to a certain age, 8, it was okay for him to watch the violence or whatever. But
I think it's a 6+, isn't it? I think that's what...
it definitely is. No, Star Wars was 6. I remember that. But no, I just thought it was so amazing, and it didn't matter because we saw it in. I think we saw your last show in Toronto.
Yeah.
Because with his work schedule and my travel and stuff like that, that was the one we could make it to. Okay. The tour was amazing. This is the kind of show I want to see again, but I also want to bring new people to see, because when you show your favorite movie to someone, you want to watch their reaction and see, okay, what are they gonna? So anyway, but I want to get into some of the other stuff that you've done by combining poetry with sitcom and poetry. You talked about what was it, Dirty Great Love Story?
Yes.
And that was a stage show. Or was that
that was a show? Yeah. So I met Katie at a poetry night, and she won a slam, and I thought she was fantastic. And we took the train home together because we both lived in Tooting in South London, and we got talking, and I discovered that she was an actor and she was a playwright and I was a playwright, and we started talking about the idea of maybe it would be interesting to try and write a poem together. Two of you, like a two-hander poem, and I had at that stage not seen anyone do a poem like that. Yeah. And so we thought, well, just very quickly came up with a story of what if we both meet. She's on what I think, do you talk about bachelor and bachelorette parties in Canada? In the UK you call it stag and hen.
Yeah, very similar. Well, we're Canadian, so we speak American and proper English.
Right.
Yeah.
Okay, great. Well, a bachelorette / stag and hen nights, and these two people have a kind of a staggering drunken night, and then fall into bed together and wake up the next morning and have to decide what to do. And we thought this would be a fun thing to tell, and we could get her point of view and my point of view, and when we were talking to each other, you would hear them do dialogue, and when they spoke to the audience, they would speak in poetry and speak their inner thoughts. And so it's sort of it's that wonderful comedy of, you think the person thinks something, but in fact they think something completely different. And we wrote that together. It was about 12-15 minutes, I think, initially, and we did it at a poetry night Katie ran in a pub in South London in Balham. And people, from the first time we did it, people really liked it, and this piece got booked. We called it a duet at that point. Sure. And it was a really fun thing to do, and quite a popular piece. And obviously you're talking about poetry, it's a very small world. There's not many people do it or go to it, but the people who do go there are sort of the most lovable weirdos in the world. And it was, people liked it, and then the following summer I was up at the Edinburgh Fringe doing a show called Skittles, which was sort of essentially a one-person storytelling show. Yeah, it's about love and candy, which is more reliable. I was doing, and it was sort of getting quite well received and well reviewed, and I was saying to Katie, look, I think we should do the duet up here. I think we should do it at the Edinburgh Fringe. And we wrote it and we expanded it out from sort of 10-15 minutes to, I think it was like 70 minutes in Edinburgh. And we had sort of in the original version, they'd woken up the next morning, decided to not go on with their stag and hen days, but spend a day with each other. So it was like a happy ending. Yeah. And in the longer version, they did not do that. They went through many stages of their lives and eventually got together at the end. And it was a hit show at the Fringe. It was a hit show. It won an award called a Fringe First for new writing up there, and it played London, it played New York, it played London with other actors. It sort of had a really good life. And that was the show which allowed me to move from being a sort of an obsessed hobbyist writer to getting income from writing. Got an agent, got an American agent, and kind of that opened a door for me for many other things which have happened since.
That was the first one then. That was the first show that you had done before. So you had done Skittles though, right?
I did a show called Skittles, in 2011,
Okay.
and then Dirty Great Love Story was 2012, and just a number of people opened a number of doors, and a writer called Chris Neal introduced me to his US agent, and then I had an agent in LA, and all of these different things happened as a result of that show, and just sort of two people in a small room in Edinburgh making jokes and telling rhymes, and it was a wonderful, wonderful break. Yeah, I'd sort of throughout my 20s, I was attempting to be a playwright. I was writing these plays, and certainly in the UK, there was a lot of kind of writer development, or there was in those days, where you could get a workshop here or a rehearsed reading there, and I was having a lot of that sort of encouragement, but without ever being close to an income, a livable income.
Right.
And so all that time I was working as a video editor to support my writing. And it was when I started combining poetry with my plays and performing as a poet, the most uncommercial possible thing you can do. Like, you take playwriting, not the most profitable medium anyway, and you add that sort of the box office catnip of poetry. but for me, it worked. I followed my strange star. And as soon as I started doing poetry, I started winning slams. I started getting booked to do gigs, and I think a plant grows towards the sunlight.
Wow.
That's what I did.
What was it? I guess it sounds like it was poetry first and then playwriting, and then you merged them, or was like what came first, the play or the poem?
Well, so I would, in terms of trying to be a writer, it was playwriting first. So that's what I did at university. That's what I did in my 20s. I'd always written poems for sort of like very bad birthday card poems, which would be sort of happy birthday, Mark, my lighting is quite dark. It would be that level of kind of kind of stuff. But then the first proper play I wrote was in rhyming couplets at university. Do you have pantomimes in Canada? You probably don't have pantomimes. You do, yeah. Okay, great. So in the UK, pantomimes are often, they have a lot of rhyme in some of them, and so I wrote a Cinderella and a Beanstalk. It was a mashup ahead of its time of Cinderella and Jack and a Beanstalk, and that was in rhyming couplets. And I remember having a feeling that I really enjoyed writing that way, and you get laughs from good rhymes and you get laughs from bad rhymes as well, which is really helpful. So if you have a character say, isn't this a silly caper, look at this photosynthesizing skyscraper, you will get a laugh for the forced nature of your rhyme. And if a rhyme is elegant and it hits particularly if you can hit your punchline on the second rhyme of a couplet, that's incredibly helpful. It deepens the laughter, I think, because there's an extra punch to it. But then I stopped writing poetry in my plays. No one told me to. I just decided to try to be Timberlake Wertenbaker or Arthur Miller or August Wilson or any of these other fantastic writers, but they already exist, those writers. They are really good at being themselves. There's no need for me to try and be them. And it took me essentially 10 years of my life and a bit of heartbreak to start writing poetry. And then that was what really unlocked it for me.
Wow. See, when I think, coming from the book world, the writer book world, when I think of poetry, yes, the most enjoyable poetry has been when I've gone to hear it live rather than reading it on a page. But I always think about, okay, and I just, a couple months ago, I had a poet that I know, a horror writer who just released a book of poetry, and we chatted about that. Have you actually published any poetry books or any play/poetry books, or is it all live performance?
So I've not poetry per se, but I might have some of them. So two of my plays have been published. Dirty Great Love Story was published.
Okay.
And also, I don't know if I've got Wingman here. There's another one of mine. So Wingman and Skittles are published as well. So this is
okay.
That's Dirty Great Love Story. That's online. I don't know if there's if the sort of physical copy is available. It's published by Methuen and Bloomsbury, and Wingman and Skittles is also they're all available as electronic publishing, if not in physical copies.
So that means if somebody here in
Text.
Canada wanted to license to do that dirty, great love story here in Canada,
Yeah, they can do it. It gets licensed for amateur production every now and then, and which is
yeah.
lovely to know it's got life beyond us.
Yeah, I've had that happen once. A play that I've written was performed. It wasn't licensed because I don't have an agent or anything. It was just performed by a local high school, and
Oh,
it was just so cool to see somebody else direct my play.
yes.
That's got to be have you ever had a chance to see somebody else put on one of the things that you've written?
So yeah, this is for the off West End run of Dirty Great Love Story. The original one had Katie and I on the cover. Had this on the cover.
Okay.
Um,
Yeah.
so this was Felix Scott and Aisha Antoine played the parts in this, and they were great. It was very interesting to watch other people play it. Felix is a lot better looking than me, so the kind of the nerdy, bespectacled lead character suddenly got a bit of a glow up, which was nice for Richard in the play. But yeah, and I've written, for example, we're working on a musical adaptation of a movie which I cannot sing. No one needs to hear me sing. So I've seen actors play lines I've written in other forms as well.
Oh man. Okay, so I want to go back to some of the logistics of we'll start with Die Hard, Yippee Ki-Yay, the
Yeah.
stage play. So I know when I was writing the book, I had to license images for use, like movie poster and stuff like that. How does that work in terms of you needing any permissions from Disney now? Yeah,
Yeah.
because they told me go away, little boy, when I tried to get license for the cover. I could license
Okay.
the interior of
Yeah.
the book, but not the cover, so I had to have an artist sketch the bloody shirt.
Okay.
And so yeah, they kind of said, "Go away, little boy. You probably can't afford to talk to us or whatever."
Right, okay. So this is really James Seabright, our producer, is the person you should really be asking this question
Oh,
of.
okay.
As I understand it, it's to do with parody, and
Of course.
I wrote this play not knowing if it was stageable, because obviously it's borrowing from Die Hard,
Yeah.
and I wrote it just because I wanted to write it and I felt it'd be a good escape during lockdown. And then a friend of mine, John Britton, said, "I'll talk to James." James does a show. He then did a show. He still does it called Potted Potter, which is all
Oh,
of
yes.
that. Books and
Yes, that's him. Okay. Oh, wow.
and so he has kind of previous with this sort of IP adjacent production,
And
and
escaping Rowling's lawyers is even scarier than Disney's lawyers sometimes.
maybe I don't know, but he said to be a parody, your show needs to have changed the form of the original
Okay.
and comment on the original, and mine definitely did that. It's got one actor. It's largely in poetry, and you've seen the show, like particularly towards the end, I comment quite a lot on the original, and and do various things to it towards the end, and so I had sort of unwittingly done everything you needed to do to be a parody without knowing what a parody was. So that was just a great stroke of luck for me, I think. It can be staged, it had this sort of life. But yeah, that's how. And so there isn't any actual imagery from the movie in the stage show. Partly because what we're doing is retelling it, but also probably for that reason too, although we wouldn't have wanted to put it in there anyway, I guess.
Yeah, yeah. No, no, I was just curious about that because that can sometimes be a loophole. So I want to talk about, so this was a personal project. This was something you were working on, and then you got a director.
Yeah.
How did that work? Because you're the source. You created all this, and I mean somebody else telling you. I mean, how does that work? Because you have to kind of let go of some of that.
Yeah, so absolutely, and I wanted to. So one of the reasons, one of the differences between this and my previous shows is, well, one difference is it's retelling a movie. The other difference is it's much more physical than stuff I've done before, which has been staged and sometimes has had not just me in it, but this has got a fantastic movement director, an associate director in Emma Webb. It's got puppetry, it's got stage fighting, it's got kind of massive great, it's got the set is the lights, the lights are great, and it's got a sort of what to me is a delightful idea, wasn't my idea, of having sort of finger guns and great big Hollywood sound effects when those guns fire. So which makes, I think, it makes the audience complicit in the silliness and the theatricality of it, because we're not trying to show things in a kind of very realistic way. Yes. We're doing it it's quite playful. It's quite like children playing, right? And so I knew I needed collaborators to bring this to life, because I'd sort of written more than I knew how to stage. And so Hal Chambers, the director, was sort of instrumental in this. He brought on a sound designer. We're working with my friend Emma Webb, who's the movement director, and I knew I couldn't do this on my own, so I wanted that collaboration. I'd written this great big thing, because I wrote it not really intending for it to be on. I mean, as I wrote it, I thought, this is quite good. I hope this can be on a stage. But initially, it was just for the fun of writing it. And so I wasn't really concerned with stageability. So John has a fight now with Tony, who's Big Carl's brother. Well, I'm just going to write this fight and then later on work out how to do it, And so I needed those collaborators, and they were essential to the show. It would be just vastly worse, and I think you wouldn't have got to see it if they hadn't been working on the show.
Yeah. I just think, so here in Canada, there was a TV show. This was actually the person who inspired Mr. Rogers in the US, was Mr. Dress Up, and he had what's called a tickle trunk. So Canadians talk about, it's where you have your little costumes and you pull things. He always pulled something out, and he would always, and you had a tickle trunk, like sort of tickle trunks that you're constantly pulling things out of. And every single time you went, I mean, there's certain running jokes with the hair. There's certain running jokes with the waterfall, but then you're constantly getting the tickle trunk, where you've got like little miniatures, and you've got the bear, obviously, a big part of it. Was that part of the script, or was that something that was worked in later as it was being developed for that? Okay, now we're doing the one-man show. So most of it was originally in the script, but then how it happened changed. So. Right. For example, in the movie, John gets dirtier and dirtier. That he goes from his sort of coat to his shirt to his vest to barefoot to gradually that vest gets dirtier and sometimes less dirtier and then more dirty as the script goes on. So I knew I wanted to do that. But originally, I had a white vest on top of like a grey vest on top of a black vest, and I took the vest off. Oh, I see. Okay. Yeah, and then I think it was Hal said, let's just make it dirty. So there's a point in the middle of the show where I cover myself in stage blood, and there's another stage where I cover myself in what is actually cocoa powder, when he blows the elevator shaft. So it was things like that where we know we want John to get dirty like he is in the film. How do we execute that in a way that's kind of fun and also like quick to do, because you don't want to stop the action for too long to have these things happen. Yeah. So most of it is inspired by the movie and some things were in the script. So the bear fight, I have a fight with a teddy bear at the beginning of the show. That was in the script. Hal was initially a bit unsure about that. But then he got into the idea very quickly, and he'd worked a lot with puppetry in his past career, so that's why it's sort of he taught me a lot of puppetry, and then Emma did help with him, did the movement side of things, and so it's a collaboration between us and the sound designer, and then the LX as well. So wow, most of it's mutual. Well, I have to say, anyone listening, if you get a chance, this is playing anywhere near you. It's worth a several-hour drive to get there and to check it out. And I'm curious, of course, if I ever get a chance to see any of your other performances. But you also did. So we talked a little bit. You mentioned WINGMAN, the father-son show. So that's also a stage show, or was that a radio? Yeah, that's also a stage show. So that's a two-hander with me and my friend Jerome Wright played my dad in that. And that was when, I wrote that when I was just about to be a father for the first time, and I was reflecting a lot on what it is to be a son and to be a father as well. And so it's a two-hander between a son and his dad. It's essentially sort of if you can imagine a romantic comedy, but between father and son. So not romantic love, but family love, in that they really rub each other the wrong way. The dad's been out of the son's life for a long time when the mum dies, and that sort of forces them back into each other's orbit just at a time when the son is becoming a father. So it's comic, it's raw, it's one of my favorite things I've written, and that was that's a show which it played the Edinburgh Festival, it played in London. It got option for UK TV, it got option for US TV, it has yet to be on TV. That happens with options, yeah. It does happen, yeah. And funny enough, one of the things which is sort of
so nice about Yippee Ki-Yay is I write, perhaps like you, I don't know, but I write so many things which don't actually get to see a reader or a viewer or an audience member, so many things which end up as kind of an elaborate PDF on my hard drive.
Yeah.
That writing something like Yippee, which I think it's now in its fourth year of being performed, that's sort of, to have that ongoing connection from a piece is fantastic. And also for me as a writer, to have that income from one piece, I'm still getting income from it 4 years later. That's hugely helpful and sort of not what I've experienced before in the theatre.
Oh man, that is amazing that it's a show that can continue, like Cats.
Yes. Yeah. One of the nicest moments from Yippee Ki-Yay is Stephen E. D'Souza, who is one of the co-writers of Die Hard and Die Hard 2.
Yeah.
He came to see the show in London.
Oh my God, that must have been so. Did you get a chance to meet him?
I did, yes. I was really nervous because, I think you've seen the show. I think it's clearly the creation of someone who's a colossal fan of Die Hard.
Yeah,
but also,
for sure.
We have fun with Die Hard. We change the ending. We criticize certain bits in a loving way. And so I was quite nervous as to what he would think. And he came as, there's a festival called the London Action Festival. Yeah. And they were having him over because I think he was talking about a screening of, maybe it was Commando or some of his other movies. I think he was doing Q&As for and this kind of thing. And they thought they'd seen my show at Wilton's Music Hall, and they thought it'd be fun to have this with Stephen watching it. And so we did it in the Royal Albert Hall, believe it or not, in a small at the top of, but at the Royal Albert Hall. And Stephen came along, and it was quite a strange show because when it began, the audience were quite quiet. And I realized that everybody there were basically massive Die Hard nerds like me. And they knew Stephen was there, and they were there sort of to see the show, but I think really to see Stephen and see what Stephen thought of the show. And so I think everyone was sort of slightly, what does Stephen think of the show? Watching the thing. And then luckily he started laughing. He was clearly enjoying it. And I think that freed up the rest of the room to enjoy it as well. And
yeah.
Really nice show. And then, we did a Q&A afterwards, and he was incredibly gracious and kind about it. We got to have dinner, and, we sort of email sometimes, and he's given us like a PR quote for the show. And he's an absolute gent. He's a lovely man. And, it's funny, sort of beyond my wildest dreams that I've got to meet writers of this work, which meant so much to me and means so much to me. I feel incredibly lucky.
Oh, that is amazing. Because I mean, Stephen took an existing script, which was based on a pretty good book.
Mm.
The script was way better than the book. And then Stephen, I mean, he added that love story element to it, which is so you've done the same work to his script that he did to the original, right? Yeah. When you think about it, right? He added this whole beautiful element that makes it such a classic. And that's what I think makes your show such a classic, is you took, and obviously you parody it because you love it so much. Yeah. And so the laughs are, that is funny. Ha ha ha. Oh man, I never thought of it that way, but I still love it.
Yes. Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. It's, I mean, and also, I watch it. I'm still watching it at Christmas, on our last tour, Benji's the technical stage manager who does all the lights and sounds on the day. Okay. We went to see it with me still in my vest from the show, the blood stains. We went to see it play in Denver. Yeah. So we're all fans of it. Definitely.
Well, the one thing I regret is not wearing the sweater I had made for a photo shoot, because I did a bunch of photo shoots for my author photo, and one of them is me with a Christmas hat with a sweater that says "Ho ho ho! Now I have a machine gun." It's like, why didn't I wear that to the show? What was I thinking? So my apologies for that.
That's all right. I've loved it if you had done. I think we get a lot of Nakatomi 1988 Christmas party shirts. We get a few of those ones. I think it was in Indianapolis. It might have been Milwaukee. Someone turned up in full Dead Tony. So he had that jumper, he had that sweatshirt, he had the grey sweatpants and the hat, and the sign, and took a photo. So that was a nice touch. But we had quite a few people in vests as well, in A shirts as well on this last tour, really nice.
Yeah,
So
that it was. I was so pleased to see other people in the audience that were sort of dressed themed
yeah,
appropriately. It was like, yes, I'm not alone. There are so many other people who love this. Can
no,
I
I'm not.
ask a huge favor? Could I love your American accent when you do John?
Mhm.
Is there a line you could just quickly?
Sure, yeah. Let's go. Hello, I'm John McClane. I hate flying, but I'm on a plane.
And that's a perfect example, a wonderful teaser for the incredible power of poetry, parody, and obviously your passion for this. So you said you're working on a musical or sort of state a parody of a musical that's coming.
Yeah, it's not a parody. It's a musical adaptation of a movie called Son of Rambow, which is a British movie from, I think, the late early noughties, maybe, I think, or and it was so Will Poulter's first film. It's a beautiful movie about a sort of coming of age story of kind of an Artful Dodger character and an Oliver character. The Oliver character is he's a member of a religious group called the Plymouth Brethren, who I think they do have in the US and Australia and around the world. And essentially, he's grown up not being allowed to read books, listen to music, or watch TV or films. And then the Artful Dodger character, kind of naughty character, played by Will Poulter, shows him his first movie, and it is Rambo: First Blood, right? So it's got a quintessential action movie, and so that blows his mind, and they start making a film together, and it's a brilliant story about sort of the power of art, friendship, coming of age, leaving of religious belief, and how that frees you up, and what kids used to get up to in the 80s before they had to be safe the whole time. So it's so it's a lovely book and gives you lots of different. I'm writing a book and co-writing the lyrics with Miranda Cooper, and who's a just amazing composer, and it's a lovely story to adapt because it exists on all of these different levels, and I think that's really helpful when you're writing a musical. And yeah, I think writing a song, sitting there and Miranda and I kind of working on lyrics, and then she starts singing and a song is created before you. It's just sort of the most incredible magical alchemy you can imagine. It's huge fun.
Awesome. Well, that's something for people to look forward to when that is coming out,
Yeah.
relatively like sometime in 2025, I imagine.
I don't know. Probably no. It won't be 2025. I hope it happens at some point in the future. Sort of the pandemic sort of kicked in the gut a little bit, but I hope it comes back to life at some point.
Awesome. Okay, and where can people find out more about you online?
So my website is richmarsh.com. I'm on. Do you want my Insta and Twitter and that kind of thing, or should I give it to you so you can link it in the show?
I'll put your URL and then I'll also add your Instagram, Twitter, and
Right.
links to all the stuff that I find off your website there. I'll add that to the show notes.
Yeah. So yeah, my website's richmarsh.com, and then for more about Yippee Ki-Yay, it's ykYlive.com.
Yeah, and yeah, and sorry, you do the same handle, right? With it's and it's got the spectacle thing in it, right? You're at
Oh yeah, so it's at Specky with the good hair. So
the good hair. Yes,
yeah.
I'm so jealous.
Yeah.
Awesome, Richard.
Not
Thank you,
bad.
thank you so much for hanging out with me today.
Thanks for talking. I've really enjoyed talking to you. Thank you very much indeed.
Well, the first thing I want to just reflect on is, again, just how lucky I am that I had a chance to see Yippee Ki-Yay, the parody, the stage show. And not only that I got a chance to see it, but that after the show, Alex and I got a chance to meet Richard and chat with Richard and get to know Richard. And of course, I mean, how lucky am I that Richard agreed to come on the podcast? I had an absolute blast chatting with him. But here are a few of the things I wanted to reflect on from that conversation. And the first was, I guess, just the creative process itself, and Richard adding such an intricate layer into his show of what it is to be a fan of something, like a movie like Die Hard, and in the way that he explores how that art and experience, which he uses the example of, it could be for a song that you hear at different points in your life, but how your own personal experience with that art can have a different impact on us when it's re-experienced at different stages in our lives. And I was recently talking with my wife about reading a book at a certain time in my life and then reading it again at a different time in my life, and how my reaction to the exact same things were different based on my own experiences. I was recently talking with a writer friend who had heard that one of my favorite novels of all time was George R. Stewart's Earth Abides, and I talked about how I introduced Liz to that during the pandemic. Earth Abides being about an apocalyptic novel about a virus that kills most of the population of the world. And how I first read it when I was 14, and then read it again as an adult more than once, and then read it again collaboratively with Liz. We read it to one another during the pandemic, and just how something that has impacted you, how rereading it. I mean, it's not only comfort food, right? Watching a movie, listening to a song you love, we're reading a book again that you love so much. It's not only sort of comfort food, but you also re-experience it and can re-enjoy it in new ways, which I just love. Another passion project of mine, a passion of mine was the television show Cheers. And, I do my best. I work from home, do my best every day to actually take a break, at least a half-hour break for lunch, make something to eat, and sit down. What I've been doing is watching the half-hour episodes of Cheers, so I give myself that break, because I don't often do that when I work from home. And as I go back and I'm rewatching, just appreciating the writing of a show like Cheers, but even just appreciating everything, the production quality, the actors, all the things about that. And also, of course, it's research for a forthcoming book. But it's amazing how all these years later, decades later, that I can go back to something that I took comfort in and enjoyed when I was younger, and I'm appreciating it in a different way now, more as a writer than just somebody who was watching it as well. So that's one of the things I wanted to reflect on. The other thing was how Richard and Katie had worked on that play, and they had different versions of the play. So like there's a shorter fringe performance, and then there's a longer one, and it really reminded me of the way that Denise Baden, who is on a few episodes back, how Denise Baden had done something similar, where she had a memoir about climate change, and it turned into a stage play, and then a one-man show, or a one-hander, as actors would call it. And I was thinking, it's so cool. I mean, I'd love to introduce Richard and Denise, because the way that they, obviously their passion for stage and stuff like that, but it reminded me, I go back to something I did when I had just graduated from Carleton University, and I was teaching in a summer camp, sort of a campus camp drama program. And the way that I had kids for 2 weeks in a row, and by the end of the second week, we performed a very short one-act play. And I would always write something for the kids. Now, I had taken a show that I wrote for a group of kids called The Show Must Go On, and I ended up readapting the same play throughout the course of 2 summers that I was doing this program, because what I would do is I would take the play that I had, and I would reform characters and scenes and moments, and I would add stuff or delete stuff depending on how many kids I had in the class and their own skills and talents and abilities and desires, and cast them in different ways. And it was so funny that over this one single play that ended up being performed later on, but that how many different ways, how many different iterations of that same play I have. Probably about 30 different iterations of that play. And I love when we as writers can take something of ours and we can readapt it for different formats, for different styles, for different audiences as well. Again, I talked about, I did a keynote for a particular, I recorded a keynote for a forthcoming conference. That is content I can re-leverage in different ways depending on who the audience is or the format it's being delivered in. I love when writers can exploit their own IP in that way. And then the last thing, and this is potentially, the most important thing, because they're all important. All the things we think about and learn are important, but this was the thing, this is the genius thing, was how it was that Richard combined two of his greatest passions, poetry and playwriting. And magic happened. He talks about playwrights he admired and poets he admired and stuff like that, but they were doing their thing. And one of the things he loved was they were doing their thing. And Richard came up with his thing. He came up with his thing. And I think it's so important for us as creative people, as writers, to embrace what it is that you bring to the story. There's a theory, of course, that there are no new stories. There's, recycled, retold stories, etc. But what is the unique thing that you, as the creator, that you bring to that project, to that writing? In this particular case, it was Richard obviously combining two of his greatest passions with a passion of loving a movie, but poetry and playwriting, but also humor and those elements, that he was able to combine all those things and create something truly unique and truly Richard Marsh, which is amazing. So now you have writers admiring Richard and looking at their own ways of what they can do and how they can combine their talents. So think about that when you're looking at your own writing and the projects that resonate with you that you want to work on. And remember that focusing on those things that are truly yours, which goes back to that earlier reflection that Edward had shared of adapting it into your own way. And that's where the magic can often happen. Well, that is it for my reflections. That is it for this episode. I hope you enjoyed this conversation with Richard Marsh as much as I enjoyed having the conversation with him and sharing it with you. If there are things that you want to reflect on, please leave your comment over at starkreflections.ca. You can, as mentioned earlier, support this podcast via Patreon or via buymeacoffee.com. But you can also support the podcast by leaving a review wherever you listen to podcasts. Or, better yet, share this episode or any episode that resonates with you with someone whom you think may find value in it. But as I said, that is it for this week and this episode. Until next week, and until next episode, this is, as always, Mark Leslie Lefebvre wishing you great writing and good Stark reflections.
Thank you for listening to the Stark Reflections podcast. You can find show notes for each episode at starkreflections.ca.
The music for this podcast, Laser Groove, was composed and produced by Kevin MacLeod. Check out more of Kevin's great music at incomptech.com.